This is Counterpoint, and I'm your host, Tanya Granick-Allen. New Brunswick recently went to the polls to elect a new government, and not only do we have a new premier, New Brunswick elected its first female premier ever. The Liberal Party, under the leadership of Susan Holt, took 31 seats, reducing incumbent Premier Blaine Higgs's Conservatives to 16 seats, and then the Greens to 2. Well, what were some of the main policies and issues which dominated the election? What's next for the Conservatives, especially when their leader, Premier Higgs, lost his own seat? Well, joining me now to share his insights into the election is J.P. Lewis, a professor of political science at the University of New Brunswick in St. John. Thank you so much for joining me, JP. I appreciate your time today.
Happy to be here.
Excellent. So was the election result a surprise for you?
A Liberal win wasn't a surprise. I think the margin, though, was, even though it was maybe an extra 3 or 4 seats, I think a lot of folks were predicting a small Liberal majority. So like 20, I think my guess was 26 seats. But what was a surprise was that they got over 30, and that, as you mentioned, the Premier lost his seat. And for the folks outside of New Brunswick, so that's just north of St. John, his riding it's the town of Quispamsis, and south of that is Rothsay, and the Minister of Justice, that was his seat, and he lost as well. And those had been pretty solid Progressive Conservative seats in the last few election cycles. So that was a surprise.
Yes, absolutely. I was watching, fairly closely, and I similar to you, I suspected there was going to be a defeat. Just the magnitude was quite surprising. Now, voter turnout was actually quite high, 66%. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's where it's been the last few elections since, in the Maritimes, Atlantic Canada, turnout can be marginally higher than, say in Ontario. I know in Ontario there's been some pretty low provincial election turnout. It is surprising, though, that it wouldn't creep up a bit more. I mean, even though I think there was a Liberal government predicted, it was still seen, it was viewed as a very competitive race. There was a lot of factors that were difficult to get a handle on observing it. So, I mean, really from before the election throughout, the key issues were cost of living, access to healthcare and education. But some of the factors, like the issues around gender identification in schools, so Policy 713, it was hard to really figure out how that would play out.
Right.
And the other one being just the Liberal brand, how that might hurt Holt and her team. But they kind of ran away from the Liberal brand, really. Notably, in one of the roundtables they had, in the closing statements, I don't think Holt said the word Liberal once.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah.
Yeah, many of us were wondering, because we have seen, in British Columbia, a surge with the Conservatives provincially. They're kind of piggybacking on the popularity of the federal Conservatives. We know we're waiting for, obviously, Saskatchewan is going to go to the polls imminently. And then, of course, New Brunswick, we're watching to see what happened and how the different brands would play out. Eastern Canada is a different kind of animal, if you will. Politics are different there than in Central, Eastern, Western, or in Ontario. So talk to us a little bit more about how Suzanne Holt ran as a Liberal vis-a-vis the federal Liberals, and how did she handle that?
Well, a big thing was that, I mean, not saying the word very often. Obviously, the Prime Minister didn't come to visit. There was a big focus on, you are voting for Team Holt, like not saying
Right.
you are voting for the Liberal Party. I think, Holt and Trudeau probably would have a similar worldview. She might be a bit more to the center. But elections are always referendums on, the sitting government and the Premier. And this was obviously about Higgs, but Higgs has had a really tumultuous last couple of years within the party. Pretty rare, actually, the ministerial resignations over the government's position on policy 713, but also on Higgs's style. So it wasn't just a policy disagreement. Ministers were resigning and complaining that he wasn't listening to anyone and centralizing power, which is a common critique of any premier or prime minister. But normally it doesn't come with letters released, to the public.
Well, I want to unpack some of those complaints and some of the more nuanced issues that creeped up in this election, and we'll do that right when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around.